I now call Councillor Julian Cooper from Witney, who is speaking against the motion.
I rise to oppose this motion because I believe there's an underlying theme of F20 which has a consequence which says legalising drugs, and it totally underplays the consequence of that. I suggest that we are not doing enough to educate people, and I think there's a lot in the motion that is good. But I think that legalising drugs is not the correct policy to follow for this party. We've had quite a bit here about let's follow scientific advice. Well, certainly I've talked to people in and around Oxford who say the way that, for example, people that take cannabis and it affects the chemical balance of their brains, it is not a one-way bet. There appears to me to be an underlying assumption in this: legalise it and we will resolve a lot of the problems. To my way of thinking, read the whole of the motion, and that comes to me that we shouldn't be doing this. Now, I have to accept that not drugs affect people all in the same way. I represent the parishes of Woodstock, Blaydon and Blenheim. There was a very famous man who was born there. He smoked and drank for a lot of his life, lived to 90 years of age, and his name was Winston Churchill. So not always drugs affect people in the same way. But I do think we have to. Another experience in my life as the top person in my year at school, got 9 grade A's at O level, 4 grade A's at A level, went to Cambridge, got on drugs, and unfortunately now can't face working. Sits in a bed sit in Oxford. So I think we do have to take this very seriously, and I think we have to do more on the education side. I think there's a misconception in this that the legalisation will solve a lot of those problems, and I think if you read particularly some of the lines around 60 in the motion, that's there. I think it's a bit unfair for people to say that people that oppose this motion are cowards, and I think that was said earlier, and I would rebut that. There is a great tradition in this party of people opposing the freeing up of drugs, and when I talk about drugs I also mean alcohol and various other things. It affects different people in different ways, but I think that this is a naive motion, and I joined the party in 1974, and I think that this is not a well-founded motion in my opinion, although there were lots of good parts in it, and I shall vote against it. Thank you.
Thank you. Could Alistair Webster please stand by? And I now call Andrew Page from Inverclyde, who's the first of a number of first-time speakers.
Thank you. I would appeal to conference, as somebody who works in adult mental health, to support this motion, which is well written, carefully constructed and thoughtful in both its diagnosis and its prescribed remedies for a problem that is responsible for reinforcing poverty and further marginalising already disadvantaged individuals and their communities. There is, within this motion, a welcome emphasis on the very real and serious consequences, both personal and societal, as well as a reiteration of the need for evidence-based policy. I particularly support the call to consider re-evaluating the law, being informed by the Portuguese experience, to increase investment in treatment and rehabilitation, and all-round better provision for those of us who are affected by drug dependency. In regards to Amendment 2, I am not convinced it is necessary, and as the motion proposes an overdue impact assessment of the Misuse of Drugs Act, it is probably unwise to be constrained by the terms of legislation whose fitness for purpose is being actively questioned. However, I am in absolute support of Amendment 1, with its emphasis on prevention and tackling some of the precipitating factors leading to substance dependency. In 1997, I was homeless in Glasgow, and then for 5 months a resident in a rehabilitation centre for people with addiction problems. I'm not here to discuss my personal history, but the rehab centre was not an empowering place. While it had some positive results, it was unable to deal with some of the wider problems experienced by those of us affected by drug misuse. Most of our clients were homeless, most had experienced various social problems, most experienced mental ill health, and all of us were unemployed. These factors created various problems. Once the rehabilitation was complete, This led to a revolving door syndrome, with the same people returning to the same services time after time, never breaking that cycle of dependency. I was moved on to a council flat in Sight Hill, which Joe Swinson will know well, as a thoroughly depressed and disempowered council estate with poor housing, poor living standards and an unacceptably low life expectancy. Unfortunately, the support for recoverers, people like myself, was very limited, and drugs were far more easily available than anywhere outside Bellany Prison. And what I recall most was the poverty of the place, not just material poverty, but a poverty of hope, a poverty of ambition. And so we're not dealing with a one-off problem, but a complex web, a cycle that enslaves. And this is why I support this simple amendment, because it promotes a shift in emphasis, as well as a reappraisal of policy. And finally, I would like to mention the Kerr report, which applies specifically to Scotland, a document that champions a new approach towards improving standards of health in Scotland. This is, of course, a medical and a health issue. I currently work in mental health, and there is an inescapable relationship between drug use and mental illness. The report recommended more preventative approaches rather than reactive ones, and the need for evidence-based practice, and also for services to be as local as possible and as specialised as necessary to treat the needs of the people accessing them. That approach needs to be fully incorporated into the government's drug policies. Please support this motion and Amendment 1, and hopefully it will be. Thank you.
Could Duncan Stott please stand by? And I now call Alistair Webster from Hayward and Middleton.
I want to speak in support of the whole motion, but to talk a little about the evidence as well, because it seems to me that the calling for evidence is a very sound basis for formulating policy. It's encouraging to see that as a party we have the nerve to debate this in public, at a time the press would no doubt like to slaughter us for it. It's a hugely important issue. I have practised in the courts both as an advocate, as a judge for over 30 years, and it's plain to anybody who has spent time in that way that the drug policy which we've followed since 1967 is not working. It's absolutely clear. Lives made miserable, people criminalised and so forth. So it's not working, but is there an easy solution? Well, the short answer is no, there isn't. Decriminalisation per se carries with it its own problems. But evidence is important, and the Liberal Democrat Lawyers Association, of which I'm the chairman, 2 years ago held a conference on drugs and the law. And we took evidence from senior police officers, psychiatrists, people from the Home Office, prison reformers, and so forth. And the most fascinating and staggering figure which we had put before us was Home Office research. And the Home Office were running a project at the time aiming to take people away from going through the courts, but to get them to accept treatment when they'd been caught out on relatively minor offences. And their estimation, or their calculation, was for every £1 spent on early intervention, £9, no less than £9 was saved further down the line in terms of avoiding criminal court costs, imprisonment, long and expensive rehabilitation when someone's drug habit had become entrenched. And if you can think of another government programme that has a rate of return on investment of 900%, it's certainly one I've not heard of. Home Office research as to the cost of the drug problem in the United Kingdom, and these are fairly old figures, but they won't be any better now. In 2003 to 2004, £16.78 billion. This motion is admirable because it calls for an intelligent reassessment. Start again, look again, and see where we can get it better. And on that basis, it really deserves full support. Thank you.
Could Siran Youssef please stand by? I now call Duncan Stott from Oxford East.
Thank you, Chair. Conference. I expect many of you were at the rally last night. If you cast your minds back one evening, hopefully you can cope with that. We heard both Don Foster and Sarah Tether entertain us with some dreadful puns about George Osborne's previous cocaine use, and I won't repeat them. But what struck me about this is illegal behaviour that we were laughing about or groaning about. We wouldn't be making these jokes if George Osborne had been allegedly involved in other criminal acts, say an armed robbery. Yet an armed robbery and cocaine possession both carry a maximum sentence of 8 years in prison. There's a hypocrisy in our drug laws, and culturally our attitude towards drug use just doesn't mirror our attitudes towards other forms of illegal behaviour. Our current approach to drugs is costing our country £17 billion every year. That's more than the cost of all other forms of organised crime put together. We can't afford to be losing £17 billion a year, particularly not in the difficult economic climate we face today. That's why I welcome this motion and urge you to pass it this afternoon. The Portuguese model is proving itself, and it's having a multitude of health benefits in their country. The UK also needs to see these sorts of health benefits for our citizens. I'd like to focus particularly on lines 60 and 62, 62. They're really important, and it calls for a strict control and regulation of cannabis. And I'd like to discuss what that could mean and why that will be so beneficial. The first thing that we need is a proper age restriction on who can get hold of cannabis. The medical evidence shows that it's teenagers who are at most risk from the effects of the psychotic effects that cannabis can induce. The illegal, unregulated market we have now allows 12, 13, 14-year-olds easy access to cannabis. I've seen this for myself. I was at a music festival a few years ago. I saw drug dealers wandering around the tent and offering and selling drugs to young people, young teenagers. This must stop. And the second restriction we could see is regulating the strength available. You may have heard about skunk, this new super strength form of cannabis. On the Today programme, Nadine Dorries said this is 50 times stronger than this kind of skunk that Jackie Smith was smoking when she was at university. It isn't. Don't believe Nadine Dorries. I don't need to tell you that. It is. It seems to be a theme of this conference to bash Nadine Dorries, and there couldn't be a more useful victim. Thank you, Nadine. Thank you for helping us so much. Skunk can be 3 times stronger than the strains maybe 40, 50 years ago. But the reason skunk exists, these super strong strains exist, is because of the lack of regulation. The government could create maximum strength rules or insist that the strength of each drug, each strain of cannabis is clearly displayed on the packaging. There are many other regulations I could go into on tax, on health warnings, maybe a pharmaceutical, pharmacy-based model that Ewan suggested. I'll just skip on ahead because we need to, of course, work within the realm of political possibility here. And we're restrained quite rightly by democratic forces and what our electorate will expect from us. And there's good news here. The public do agree with the sort of reforms on cannabis as proposed in this motion. The Liberal Democrats for Drug Policy Reform, we carried out some opinion poll research last year. 70% of the public support some form of government-regulated cannabis supply. The public are with us. There's nothing to fear from this regulation. We can do it. Support this motion, both amendments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Duncan. And Duncan was also a first-time speaker.